Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the year 1492, a date that echoes across the history books, not only for Christopher Columbus setting sail across the Atlantic, but for something closer to home in Europe, the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. Picture yourself standing on a hillside, just outside the walled city, the January air crisp and heavy with the smoke of campfires. The year is drawing to its close, and the Moorish stronghold, the last jewel of Al-Andalus, is surrounded by the banners of Castile and Aragon. To the north, the snow-capped Sierra Nevada mountains glisten in the pale winter light. To the south, the red stone towers of the Alhambra palace glow faintly as torches flicker along its walls. Inside the city, the people of Granada whisper prayers in crowded mosques, ration food, and glance nervously at the horizon, knowing the end is near. You, caught in that moment, realize you're standing at the turning of ages. And, to be brutally honest, you probably won't survive this siege unless you've got the stubborn resilience of a goat and the luck of a saint. Before we dive deeper, if you've clicked on this video looking for a story about courage, betrayal, and the end of an empire, you're in exactly the right place. Tonight's journey is the fall of Granada, 492, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. Stick around, because by the end you'll know not just how Granada fell, but why it mattered for the entire world. And, hey, if you enjoy these late-night historical dives, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us your location and what time it is as you listen. Are you tuning in from a quiet midnight in Madrid, or a drowsy dawn in Karachi? Share it below. I'd love to know. Alright then, get comfortable, pull the blanket a little tighter, and let's step inside the city of Granada in its final days, when beauty and desperation walked hand in hand. Granada in the 15th century is a paradox. On the one hand, it's fragile, politically cornered, and reduced in size compared to the vast domains of Al-Andalus at its peak. On the other hand, it's dazzling, wealthy, and culturally vibrant. By 1469, when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile marry, forming a unified Christian powerhouse, Granada stands as the last Muslim enclave in Iberia. Once, Muslim Spain stretched across nearly the entire peninsula. Córdoba, Seville, Toledo, Valencia, all jewels of Islamic civilization, but now, only Granada remains, clinging to independence like a candle flickering in the wind. The city is a marvel in itself. Nestled at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, Granada is naturally defensible. Its whitewashed houses climb steep hillsides, narrow streets twist into labyrinths, and above it all rises the Alhambra, a palace fortress of red stone that glitters like a crown at sunset. Inside, courtyards filled with fountains murmur with flowing water, arabesque designs curl along the arches, and gardens overflow with pomegranates, roses, and orange blossoms. To a visitor, Granada feels like a fairy tale. Mosques echo with the call to prayer, scholars gather to debate philosophy, and merchants hawk silks and spices in bustling markets. But beneath the surface, tension simmers. The Nasrid dynasty, ruling Granada since the 1200s, has long survived by diplomacy and tribute rather than military might. Granada's rulers paid hefty sums of gold and luxury goods to Castile, essentially buying peace in exchange for autonomy. The city prospered under this uneasy arrangement, becoming a hub for artisans, poets, and traders. But by the late 1400s, the arrangement frays. Christian Spain is no longer divided into squabbling kingdoms. With Ferdinand and Isabella's marriage, Castile and Aragon unite into a single powerful force, driven not just by politics, but by religion. The Reconquista, the centuries-long push to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule, has entered its final stage, and Granada, though dazzling, is the last domino waiting to fall. Inside Granada, life in these years is both vibrant and anxious. Families still gather in courtyards to share meals of lamb, bread, and dates. Children chase each other through narrow alleys, dodging donkeys laden with firewood. Merchants still bring goods from North Africa, carpets, ivory, saffron, keeping the markets lively. But everyone knows the walls are closing in. News arrives daily of Christian armies capturing neighboring towns, of villages burned, of farmland seized. Farmers whisper that the days of Muslim rule are numbered, and every evening as the muezzins call the faithful to prayer, people look toward the mountains and wonder how long their city can hold. Religious identity saturates everything. Granada is not only a kingdom, it is the last bastion of Islam in Western Europe. Mosques hum with sermons, reminding worshippers of their duty to defend the faith. Sufi mystics wander the streets, offering words of solace. At the same time, Granada is home to Christians and Jews as well, many living under the traditional protections of dhimmi status. These communities coexist uneasily, each aware of the shifting winds. For Muslims, the thought of losing Granada means not just political defeat, but a spiritual catastrophe, the end of centuries of Islamic presence in Spain. For Christians outside the walls, the conquest of Granada is framed as a holy mission, the final act of the Reconquista, a divine triumph that will purify the land. You can feel the pressure in the palace itself. The Nasrid sultans, caught between pride and pragmatism, juggle alliances, sometimes making treaties with Ferdinand, sometimes seeking help from North Africa, sometimes fighting their own relatives. Courtiers debate endlessly, should they resist to the last man, or negotiate and preserve at least some dignity. The younger generation urges defiance, while the elders remember the fate of Córdoba and Seville, cities once glorious, now Christian strongholds. Meanwhile, the citizens prepare quietly for what they fear is inevitable. Some stockpile grain in underground storerooms. Others sell jewelry to merchants willing to risk the roads out of the city. Families make plans for exile, North Africa, perhaps Morocco, where cousins and trade links still exist, yet many cling stubbornly to hope, telling themselves that Granada's walls have stood for centuries, that its mountains are impenetrable, that the Alhambra itself is unconquerable. Still, everyone knows 1492 will bring reckoning. The Christian monarchs have already laid plans, already gathered armies, already vowed to bring the Reconquista to its conclusion. The city's beauty can no longer shield it, its wealth cannot buy it more time. What lies ahead is fire, negotiation, and surrender. So here we are, at the start of the story, a dazzling city, proud and fragile, perched on the edge of history. Granada glows like a final ember in the night, the last light of Muslim Spain. But the winds are rising, the embers are fading, and soon the candle will flicker out. The beauty of Granada, however, masks a fragile political foundation. By the mid-15th century, the Nasrid dynasty, rulers of the kingdom for over 2 centuries, were more survivors than conquerors. Unlike their predecessors in Córdoba or Seville, who had once projected power outward, the Nasrids were forced to play a cautious balancing act, constantly weighing diplomacy against defiance, tribute against rebellion. Theirs was a court defined by intrigue, where survival depended not only on the sharpness of a sword, but on the cleverness of a negotiation. The Nasrids inherited a precarious state. When the Kingdom of Granada was founded in the 1230s, it was already surrounded by advancing Christian kingdoms. Its rulers secured existence by agreeing to pay annual tribute, gold, silk, and precious goods to Castile. This arrangement was humiliating but pragmatic. The Christians gained wealth and symbolic dominance, while the Nasrids bought time and autonomy. For decades it worked. Granada remained prosperous, its artisans creating masterpieces in wood and stone, its scholars keeping alive traditions of Islamic learning. The Alhambra itself was both a palace and a message. Even a diminished dynasty could still create beauty unrivaled in Europe. But beneath the ornate arches of the Alhambra, the Nasrid rulers were plagued by instability. Succession disputes were constant. Brothers plotted against brothers, sons rose against fathers, and rival claimants sought support from outside powers. Each new sultan came to power not through peaceful inheritance but through blood, intrigue, or desperate bargains. Loyalty among courtiers was fickle, shifting with the tides of fortune. A sultan might sit on the throne one year and rot in a dungeon the next. This ceaseless turmoil eroded the kingdom's strength from within, weakening its ability to resist enemies from without. Granada's reliance on diplomacy also made it vulnerable. To survive, the Nasrids played a dangerous game of balancing between Christian Castile and Muslim North Africa. At times, they allied with Castile against rebellious nobles. At others, they appealed to the Marinids of Morocco for aid, though such help often came with strings attached. These shifting alliances bred mistrust among Granada's people. To many citizens, their rulers seemed less like protectors of Islam and more like opportunists willing to compromise the faith for survival. The economy of Granada further reflected this fragility. True, it was rich in trade, silk weaving flourished in the Alpujarras, agriculture thrived with ingenious irrigation systems, and merchants sold goods from Africa, the Mediterranean and beyond. Yet, much of this wealth was siphoned off to pay tribute to Castile. Ordinary farmers and artisans bore the burden of taxation, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. When times grew hard, poor harvests, increased demands for tribute, the people's loyalty to their rulers wavered. A dynasty dependent on money to buy peace could ill afford to appear weak. At the same time, Granada was increasingly isolated. Across the Iberian Peninsula, Christian kingdoms had consolidated their strength. Portugal pushed into the Atlantic, Castile expanded across the plains, and Aragon controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. Granada, by contrast, was shrinking, hemmed into a mountainous corner of Andalusia. What once had been a proud frontier of Islamic civilization was now a beleaguered enclave, surviving more by luck and politics than by force. And yet, for all this fragility, Granada retained a powerful identity. Its people saw themselves as heirs to centuries of Al-Andalus, the great mosques of Córdoba, the libraries of Toledo, the gardens of Seville. The Alhambra, with its intricate calligraphy and shimmering courtyards, was more than a palace. It was a statement of resilience. Each poem carved into its walls whispered of paradise on earth, a paradise that might yet endure despite the looming storm. This pride gave the Nasrids legitimacy even when their politics faltered. So long as Granada stood, Islam remained alive in Spain. But the fragility of the dynasty became painfully obvious in the decades before the final war. Court intrigues escalated, factions split the nobility, and rival claimants invited foreign intervention. By the 1470s, Granada had become less a unified kingdom than a chessboard of competing interests. Some nobles leaned toward accommodation with Castile, preferring tribute to war. Others demanded resistance, urging holy struggle to defend the last bastion of the faith. The sultans, caught in the middle, lurched from one policy to another, alienating both sides. The figure who would embody this instability most vividly was Muhammad II, better known as Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler. Even before he took the throne, Granada's politics were a swirl of betrayals. His father, Abu Hassan Ali, lost support after failing to repel Christian advances. His uncle, Al-Zagal, claimed power in opposition. Boabdil himself alternated between resisting the Christians and seeking peace with them, earning him the nickname Al-Chico, the Little One, and among some, Al-Zagobi, the Unlucky. His rule would be defined by hesitation, half measures, and division, exactly the weaknesses Ferdinand and Isabella would exploit. Granada's fragility was not unknown to its enemies. Ferdinand and Isabella watched carefully, understanding that internal weakness could be as decisive as battlefield strength. They cultivated spies, encouraged defections, and exploited family rivalries within the Nasrid court. Each quarrel in the palace was another crack in the wall of Granada's defences. By the time the war began in earnest in 1482, the kingdom was already a house divided, its strength sapped by decades of intrigue. To picture this fragility, imagine standing in the Alhambra during those years. The courtyards still sparkle with fountains, the walls still glow with carvings praising God, and the gardens still bloom with roses. But behind the scenes you hear whispers of plots, see guards watching one another, and notice the nervous eyes of courtiers who do not know whether tomorrow they will serve the sultan or his rival. The grandeur is real, but so is the fear. Granada in the late 15th century is like a glass palace perched on a cliff edge, beautiful, shimmering, admired by all, but one step away from shattering, and the winds blowing from Castile and Aragon are growing stronger by the day. By the middle of the 15th century, it was no longer possible to pretend that Granada's survival depended solely on tribute or diplomacy. To the north, the Christian kingdoms had been slowly knitting themselves together, their ambitions swelling like a tide ready to drown the last redoubt of Al-Andalus. What had once been a fractured Iberian landscape, Leon, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal jostling against each other, was consolidating into larger, more determined powers. Chief among them were Castile and Aragon, whose union through marriage in 1469 would change the fate of Granada forever. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile are remembered today as the Catholic monarchs, but in the 1470s they were also shrewd politicians who saw opportunity where others saw only exhaustion. Their marriage united the two most powerful Christian realms of Iberia into a single dynastic house. Castile brought vast lands, fertile plains, and manpower. Aragon added maritime power, Mediterranean trade connections, and political experience in Italy and beyond. Together, Ferdinand and Isabella represented something new, a united Christian front in Spain, one strong enough to finish what centuries of the Reconquista had begun. The Reconquista itself stretched back over 700 years, beginning when small Christian enclaves in the north resisted the initial Muslim conquests of the early 8th century. Over time, these enclaves grew into kingdoms, expanding southward through wars, alliances, and occasional pauses. Cities like Toledo, captured in 1085, Córdoba, 1236, Seville, 1248, and Valencia, 1238, all fell one by one, shrinking Muslim territory. By the 15th century, Granada was the last Muslim stronghold, a glittering island of Islamic culture surrounded by a sea of Christian states. Its very survival was anomalous. For many Christians, its fall was not just expected, it was destiny. Ferdinand and Isabella inherited this mindset, but they also sharpened it with religious zeal. The 15th century was an age of crusading energy, fueled by papal support and a growing sense of Christian identity in Europe. The Pope granted them indulgences, treating their campaign against Granada as a holy war akin to the Crusades in the Middle East. Priests preached sermons framing the conquest as divine duty, and soldiers rallied to the cause with the promise of spiritual reward. This religious framing gave Ferdinand and Isabella's war a fervor that went beyond mere politics. For them, Granada was not just land, it was the last bastion of Islam in Spain, a faith they intended to drive out entirely. Still, zeal alone would not conquer Granada. Ferdinand and Isabella were practical rulers who combined ideology with strategy. They centralized royal authority in their realms, curbing the independence of powerful nobles and redirecting their energies toward the Reconquista. They reformed taxation, ensuring that resources flowed steadily into war coffers. They also modernized their armies, adopting gunpowder artillery that could shatter medieval walls. Unlike earlier Christian rulers, who had often relied on seasonal levies and haphazard campaigns, Ferdinand and Isabella could wage sustained, methodical warfare. Their kingdom was stable, their armies professionalized, and their will unbroken. The contrast with Granada could not have been sharper. Where the Nasrids quarreled among themselves, Ferdinand and Isabella presented a united front. Where Granada relied on diplomacy and tribute, the Catholic monarchs relied on steady expansion and overwhelming force. Where the Nasrids hesitated between peace and war, Ferdinand and Isabella committed fully to conquest. To put it bluntly, the game had changed, and Granada was hopelessly behind the curve. The geopolitical context also favored Castile and Aragon. Portugal, their western neighbor, had turned its gaze outward, focusing on Atlantic exploration and trade with Africa. France, their traditional rival, was entangled in its own conflicts and wary of interfering in Iberia. The Muslim powers of North Africa, long a source of aid for Granada, were weakened by their own internal divisions and largely unable to intervene decisively. Granada's last hope for outside assistance was faint at best. Economics gave the Catholic monarchs yet another advantage. Granada's tribute payments had long enriched Castile, and when war began, those resources were redirected into conquest. Wealth from Castilian sheep farming, Aragonese trade, and ecclesiastical taxes all flowed into military campaigns. Ferdinand and Isabella also secured loans from Italian bankers, ensuring steady supplies and provisions. Granada, by contrast, saw its economy collapse under the weight of war. Trade routes disrupted, farmland burned, and merchants fleeing the besieged capital. But perhaps the greatest advantage Ferdinand and Isabella held was psychological. They framed the war as inevitable, a matter of destiny. Their court chroniclers wrote of Granada as a stubborn weed that must be plucked to complete the Garden of Spain. Priests thundered that God willed it. Nobles saw the conquest as a chance for glory and land. Common soldiers, promised loot or remission of sins, flocked to the banners. To oppose this tidal wave of conviction, Granada had only fragmented loyalties and fading traditions. It is worth imagining the symbolic stakes of the Reconquista at this point. For centuries, Christian Spain defined itself in opposition to Al-Andalus. The fall of Granada would not just end a war, it would seal a narrative. Spain would be Christian from the Pyrenees to the sea. To Ferdinand and Isabella, this meant not only fulfilling a divine mission, but also consolidating political legitimacy. Their dynasty would be remembered as the one that completed the Reconquista, securing eternal fame. And in January 1492, just days after Granada surrendered, they would commission Columbus to sail west, linking the fall of the last Muslim kingdom with the dawn of Spain's global empire. The timing was no accident. The fall of Granada was both an ending and a beginning. For Granada's people, however, these broader narratives mattered little. Compared to the immediate reality, they faced two monarchs who were united, determined, and far stronger than any Christian rulers they had faced before. When Ferdinand and Isabella turned their attention southward in 1482, the Kingdom of Granada was doomed, though the exact timing and manner of its fall remained uncertain. So, as you picture the landscape of Iberia in the late 15th century, imagine the mountains and plains dotted with Christian armies, their banners bearing the cross, their cannons dragged by oxen. Imagine priests preaching at dawn, soldiers sharpening swords by firelight, nobles calculating which towns to seize next. Now imagine Granada, a city of poets, artisans and traders, caught like a jewel in a tightening vice. The Reconquista had begun centuries earlier, but under Ferdinand and Isabella, it would finally reach its crescendo. Granada's fate was sealed not only by its own fragility, but by the rise of its enemies. The Catholic monarchs were not merely rulers. They were the embodiment of a movement centuries in the making, and in their hands the Reconquista would end with the sound of cannons against the Alhambra's walls and the sight of Boabdil's tearful surrender. If Granada seemed like a fragile kingdom politically, geographically it appeared almost untouchable. For centuries its survival was owed as much to its strategic location as to its diplomacy. The Nasrids ruled from a capital that was a fortress in itself, guarded by mountains, rivers, and sheer natural barriers that turned invasions into ordeals. Even Ferdinand and Isabella, with their united kingdoms and modern artillery, could not simply storm in and expect an easy victory. Granada's terrain was both shield and sword, shaping the rhythm of the war, and explaining why it endured longer than anyone might have expected. Let's start with the most imposing feature, the Sierra Nevada mountains. Rising dramatically above the city, their snowy peaks form a natural wall cutting Granada off from the heart of Castile. In winter these passes were treacherous. Avalanches, ice, and freezing winds made campaigns nearly impossible. For centuries these mountains had petted the Nasrid heartland from swift invasion. Christian armies might seize towns on the plains, but pushing deep into Granada's valleys meant navigating rugged terrain where ambushes were easy and supply lines stretched dangerously thin. The capital itself was also a marvel of defense. Perched on steep hillsides, its neighborhoods wound upward in mazes of narrow streets that baffled invaders. At its crown stood the Alhambra, not just a palace, but a citadel. With its thick walls, towers, and commanding views of the surrounding land, the Alhambra was practically impregnable without a long siege. Inside, it was stocked with armories, cisterns of water, and storehouses that could support defenders for months. To an approaching army, it looked less like a city and more like a mountain fortress glowing red in the setting sun. Beyond the city, Granada's countryside offered additional strength. The kingdom stretched across fertile valleys irrigated by ingenious canals that had been perfected under centuries of Muslim rule. The Vega of Granada, a wide and fertile plain, was dotted with villages, orchards, and fields of wheat, barley, and pomegranates. These farmlands not only fed the population but also supplied grain for armies. Christian soldiers often found themselves burning crops and raiding villages in frustration, because they could rarely force Granada into open battle. Instead, the Nasrids relied on the land's productivity to withstand sieges and to finance tribute payments when necessary. Granada's defensive advantage was not limited to agriculture. Its ports on the Mediterranean, though modest compared to larger harbours like Seville or Valencia, provided lifelines to North Africa. Through these harbours flowed trade goods, ivory, gold and slaves, as well as potential reinforcements and supplies. While North African dynasties were rarely in a position to send massive armies, their presence across the sea gave the Nasrids bargaining chips and occasional aid. For decades these maritime links gave Granada the sense of being part of a wider Islamic world, even as it became increasingly isolated in Iberia. Economically, Granada's location gave it another edge. The silk industry. The Alpujarras, mountains south of the capital, produced mulberry trees, essential for silkworms, and generations of skilled weavers had turned Granada into a center of textile production. Its silk was highly prized across Europe and North Africa, traded for silver and spices. This trade enriched the Nasrid treasury, funding both tribute payments to Castile and the construction of Granada's dazzling palaces. Even as the Reconquista advanced, the city's economic base allowed it to hold out far longer than expected. But geography and trade could only delay the inevitable. not prevent it. By the late 15th century, the very features that had preserved Granada for centuries also became limitations. The mountains that once shielded the kingdom now cut it off from swift reinforcement. The fertile plains, when scorched by Christian armies, became liabilities. Destroyed fields meant famine within the walls. The ports that once linked Granada to North Africa offered little comfort when Morocco and the Maghreb were embroiled in their own conflict. Still, the strategic importance of Granada cannot be overstated. For Ferdinand and Isabella, capturing it meant more than completing the Reconquista. It meant securing control of southern Spain's trade routes, opening the way to the Mediterranean, and eliminating the possibility of Muslim alliances on Iberian soil. Granada was both a symbol and a prize, the last foothold of Islam in Europe, west of the Balkans, and a jewel whose capture would cement Spain's rising power. The war to take Granada was shaped entirely by its terrain. Rather than sweeping victories, Ferdinand and Isabella waged a war of attrition, capturing one fortress at a time, cutting off trade routes, and slowly strangling the kingdom. They built new fortified towns, like Santa Fe, planted right on Granada's doorstep, to serve as permanent bases for their armies. They deployed heavy artillery, dragging cannons across mountains that once made cavalry charges useless. Slowly, methodically, they turned Granada's strengths into weaknesses. Inside the city, the people clung to the hope that geography would save them, as it had in the past. They told themselves that the Sierra Nevada was unconquerable, that the Alhambra's walls would never fall, that their fertile plains would sustain them indefinitely. But as the years dragged on, and one town after another fell to Christian armies, the illusion of invincibility began to crumble. Even mountains could not resist cannon fire forever, and even fertile valleys could not yield crops when they were set ablaze. Picture yourself in Granada during this time. You walk through the Alhambra's courtyards, marveling at the arabesques carved into stone, the fountains still burbling in delicate gardens. From the towers you look out at the Vega plain, once a patchwork of fields, now scarred with smoke from enemy raids. In the distance you see Christian banners rising over captured fortresses. You feel the weight of geography pressing in, not as a shield but as a cage. Granada's strategic position, once the secret of its survival, had become the stage of its slow suffocation. The kingdom could not be taken in a single blow, but neither could it resist forever. Its mountains, its plains, its ports, all that had sustained it now served as reminders of how much it had to lose, and Ferdinand and Isabella, patient and relentless, were determined to take every inch of it. In this sense, Granada was not just a kingdom at war, it was a fortress under siege by history itself. For centuries the Reconquista had pushed southward, and now the tide had reached the final shore. The land that had protected the Nasrids for so long could delay the inevitable, but it could not stop it. The last Muslim kingdom in Spain was living on borrowed time. By 1482, the delicate balance that had allowed Granada to survive for centuries finally collapsed. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the time had come to launch a full-scale war, no longer satisfied with sporadic raids or tribute payments, and for the Nasrids, weakened by factional rivalries and economic strain, the timing could not have been worse. The conflict that began in that year would become a systematic campaign, methodical, relentless, and fueled by religious fervor that chipped away at the last Muslim stronghold in Spain until only Granada itself remained. The spark was not some grand declaration, but a border clash. Skirmishes between Castilian and Granadan forces were nothing new. Both sides had long tested the fragile frontier. But in 1482, Ferdinand and Isabella seized upon these incidents as a pretext to escalate. Their eyes were already fixed on the prize. The Christian monarchs had recently stabilized their realms after the Castilian succession war, and their political position was stronger than ever. With a papal bull authorizing a crusade, they could frame the campaign not merely as conquest but as a holy mission. Soldiers were promised indulgences, noblemen were promised land, and the church blessed every banner raised against Granada. Granada, meanwhile, was in turmoil. The reigning sultan, Abu Hassan Ali, known as Muley Hassan to the Christians, faced both external pressure and internal dissent. Though he was determined to resist Castile, his reign was undermined by rebellion within his own family. His son, Muhammad XII, better remembered as Boabdil, challenged his rule, seizing Granada itself in a coup backed by factions within the city. His uncle, Muhammad XIII, El Zargal, also maneuvered for power. Instead of presenting a united front, the Nasrids fractured into rival camps, each claiming legitimacy. The Christians could hardly have asked for a better opportunity. The early campaigns set the tone for the war. In 1482, Christian forces moved swiftly against Alhambra, a fortress town guarding access to the heart of Granada. The battle was brutal, but the Castilians captured it, and held it despite fierce counterattacks. The fall of Alhambra was a shock. It was the first time Christian forces had penetrated so deeply into Granada territory in decades. For Ferdinand and Isabella, it was a propaganda triumph. They celebrated it as the key to Granada. For the Nasrids, it was a devastating blow to morale, a sign that their defences were not impregnable after all. The war did not unfold in one sweeping invasion, but rather in a series of sieges and counter-sieges, punctuated by betrayals and shifting alliances. Castilian forces advanced deliberately, targeting key strongholds, cutting off trade routes, and forcing towns into submission. Their armies were better supplied, with artillery that could batter down walls once thought invincible. Granada's defenders fought bravely, but their resources were stretched thin. Every fortress lost was another thread cut from the kingdom's fabric. One of the strangest dynamics of the war was the role of Boabdil, captured by Ferdinand's forces in 1483, after a failed battle at Lucena. Boabdil was released on surprisingly generous terms. The Catholic monarch saw in him a useful pawn, a sultan who might weaken Granada further through civil war. And indeed, when Boabdil returned to the city, he deepened the divisions, battling his father and uncle for control. Instead of uniting against the common enemy, the Nasrids spent precious energy tearing each other apart. Meanwhile, Ferdinand and Isabella pushed their advantage. They built a new style of warfare in Iberia. Slow, methodical sieges backed by artillery. In 1485, they captured Ronda, a fortress city perched dramatically above a gorge. In 1486, they took Loja and then Malaga, a crucial port on the Mediterranean. Each victory tightened the noose around Granada. Malaga's fall in particular was catastrophic for the Nasrids. It severed their access to the sea, cutting off trade and the hope of reinforcements from North Africa. Its population, subjected to massacre and enslavement, became a grim warning of what awaited other towns that resisted too stubbornly. Inside Granada, the civilian population suffered immensely. As Christian armies advanced, refugees poured into the capital, straining already scarce resources. Farmers abandoned fields, markets emptied, and the spectre of famine loomed. The people clung to their faith, filling mosques with prayers for deliverance. But even the most devout must have felt despair as town after town fell. Worse still, they saw their rulers quarreling rather than uniting. For ordinary Granadans, it must have seemed like the dynasty itself had abandoned them. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the war was not without challenges. Maintaining year-round campaigns was expensive, and their armies relied heavily on loans from bankers and the support of noble families. But their strategy was sound. Rather than gamble everything on one massive confrontation, they wore Granada down fortress by fortress, starving it of resources and allies. The papacy's support, combined with the lure of spoils, kept their soldiers motivated, and every victory fed into a larger narrative. The Reconquista was nearing completion. The psychological weight of this narrative cannot be overstated. For centuries, Christian rulers in Spain had dreamed of the day when the crescent flag would no longer fly over Iberian soil. By the 1480s, that dream felt within reach. Chroniclers compared Ferdinand and Isabella to biblical kings and saints. Their court poets framed the campaign as divine will, inevitable and righteous. Each town captured was celebrated not just as military success, but as fulfillment of prophecy. For the Christian world, the Reconquista was not merely a war of conquest, it was a story of redemption, and Granada was the final chapter. Granada's leaders tried to resist, but their options dwindled. Internal rebellions sapped their strength, alliances with North Africa faltered, and Christian armies kept pressing forward. By the late 1480s, it was clear that the war had shifted decisively in Ferdinand and Isabella's favour. The Nasrids still held their capital, but it was only a matter of time. Imagine walking the streets of Granada in 1489. The markets that once overflowed with silks and spices are sparse. Refugees sleep in alleyways, families huddle in cramped houses, and whispers of defeat hang in the air. From the Alhambra's towers you can see smoke rising from the countryside, as Christian armies burned fields and villages, At night, the call to prayer echoes across a city that feels besieged not only by armies but by history itself. The war that began in 1482 had set in motion an unstoppable chain of events. Each fortress captured, each town subdued, brought Granada closer to its end. And as the walls of the kingdom shrank inward, its rulers fought one another, hastening the collapse. The fall of Granada was no longer a question of if, but when. If Ferdinand and Isabella were methodical in tightening their grip on Granada, the Nasrid dynasty seemed determined to sabotage itself from within. Perhaps nothing weakened Granada more than its internal divisions, the family feuds and rival factions that tore apart the kingdom at the very moment it most needed unity. It is one of history's cruel ironies that Granada might have held out far longer, or perhaps even negotiated better terms had its leaders stood together. Instead, the palace of the Alhambra became a nest of conspiracies, betrayals and shifting loyalties, with every crack widening just as the Christian armies pressed closer. The seeds of division were already deep in Nasrid history. Unlike some dynasties where succession was orderly, the Nasrids often saw brothers, sons and uncles contesting the throne. Power rarely passed peacefully. It was seized, sometimes with daggers in the night, sometimes with open rebellion. This constant instability meant that loyalty among Granada's nobles was always fragile. Families aligned themselves with different claimants, ready to switch sides if fortunes changed. For a kingdom that survived largely on diplomacy, such weakness was fatal. By the 1470s, the rivalry had hardened into three main figures: Sultan Abul Hassan Ali, Muli Hassan, his brother Muhammad XIII, known as El-Zagal, and Abul Hassan's son Muhammad XII, better remembered as Boabdil. Each man had supporters among the nobility, and each believed himself the rightful ruler. The result was chaos. Granada sometimes had two, even three rival sultans at once, with different parts of the kingdom acknowledging different leaders. Instead of uniting against Castile, the Nasrids fought among themselves, draining their resources and inviting Ferdinand and Isabella to exploit their quarrels. Abul Hassan Ali, the elder, was known for his determination to resist Christian advances. He was a proud, defiant ruler, unwilling to bow to Castile, but his harsh policies alienated many, and his inability to stop Ferdinand's early campaigns eroded confidence. His brother El-Zagal, meanwhile, was a skilled warrior, earning respect on the battlefield. Yet he, too, was divisive, accused of arrogance and cruelty. And then there was Boabdil, the little king, young, ambitious, but indecisive. When he rebelled against his father in 1482 and briefly took Granada for himself, the city split down the middle. To many, his rise seemed like a chance for new leadership. To others, it was betrayal. This family feud would have been bad enough in peacetime. In wartime, it was catastrophic. Instead of concentrating troops against Ferdinand and Isabella, the Nasrids wasted precious men fighting each other. Castile, watching gleefully, intervened whenever it suited them. When Boabdil was captured by Christian forces at the Battle of Lucena in 1483, Ferdinand treated him not as an enemy but as an asset. He was released on the condition that he pay homage and effectively serve as a vassal. Boabdil accepted, calculating that Christian backing would help him reclaim Granada from his father and uncle. It was a devil's bargain. In seeking the throne, he tied his fate to the very monarch's dismantling his kingdom. The people of Granada must have looked on in despair. In the streets and markets, ordinary families bore the brunt of the war raids, famine, soaring taxes, while their rulers quarreled like spoiled heirs. One chronicler describes Granadan citizens whispering bitterly that their leaders were more enemies to one another than to the Christians. How could they trust a dynasty that seemed more concerned with palace intrigues than with the survival of their faith? The divisions weren't limited to the royal family. The Nasrid nobility was fractured as well, with powerful clans aligning with different claimants. Some backed Abu Hassan's defiance, others supported El-Zagal's militarism, while still others placed their bets on Boabdil's willingness to negotiate. Tribal loyalties, personal grievances, and opportunism all played a role. In effect, Granada became a patchwork of shifting allegiances. Its unity dissolved just as the enemy grew stronger. Even religious leaders were drawn into the rivalries. Some clerics urged jihad, calling for total resistance to Castile. Others counseled pragmatism, suggesting negotiation or submission as the only path to survival. Mosques echoed with debates, prayers, and sometimes anger, as the faithful wondered which course was truly righteous. Was it better to fight to the last breath, or to preserve lives through compromise? This moral uncertainty mirrored the political divisions, leaving the population uncertain and anxious. The Christian monarchs knew how to exploit this weakness. Ferdinand and Isabella skillfully played the rival factions against each other, promising support to Boabdil when it suited them, negotiating with El-Zagal when it was useful, and always ensuring that Granada remained divided. They understood the principle of divide and conquer, and the Nasrids handed them the perfect opportunity. While Granada bled itself in civil strife, Castile advanced fortress by fortress, tightening the noose. It is easy to imagine the atmosphere in Granada during this time. Picture the Alhambra's halls, once filled with poetry readings and music, now echoing with whispered plots, hurried meetings, and guards watching every doorway. Servants trade gossip about which faction controls the city this week. In the streets, banners change as one claimant replaces another, but for the ordinary people, little changes. They still face hunger, uncertainty, and the sight of enemy fires glowing on the horizon. Boabdil himself became a tragic symbol of this division. Though remembered today as the last king of Granada, he was more a pawn than a master. His attempts to balance resistance with negotiation satisfied no one. To hardliners, he was a traitor who courted the Christians. To moderates, he was weak and indecisive. His nickname, El Zogobi, the Unlucky, reflected not only his personal misfortunes, but also the doomed state of his kingdom. He fought for a throne that was collapsing beneath him, a tragic figure caught between ambition and inevitability. The internal divisions also eroded Granada's ability to inspire its people. In earlier centuries, Muslim rulers in Spain had been able to frame their cause as a defense of civilization, learning, and faith. But in the 1480s, the Nasrids seemed more concerned with personal power than collective survival. This loss of moral authority sapped the population's will to resist. Even as Ferdinand and Isabella preached their holy mission, the Nasrid rulers failed to articulate a vision that could unify their people. Had the Nasrids united, had Abu al-Hassan, El-Zagal, and Boabdil stood together, the war might have dragged on for decades. The terrain, the fortresses, and the fertile lands could have supported a prolonged resistance. Perhaps they could have secured more favorable terms, or even carved out partial autonomy, but division made such possibilities impossible. By fighting among themselves, they delivered victory to Ferdinand and Isabella, without the Christians needing to risk everything in a single decisive battle. The story of Granada's internal divisions is a reminder that empires often fall not only to external enemies, but to internal decay. Walls and fortresses can hold off armies, but not when those inside them are quarreling. Granada's fate was sealed as much by palace intrigue as by cannon fire. So when you picture the fall of Granada, don't only imagine Christian soldiers breaching its walls. Imagine too the whispered betrayals in the Alhambra, the rival banners fluttering over its towers, the bitter arguments in its council chambers. The city was already fractured long before it surrendered in 1492. Its rulers had lost the trust of their people, and its dynasty had torn itself apart. Ferdinand and Isabella may have delivered the final blow, but it was the Nasrids themselves who opened the cracks that made it possible. As the 1480s dragged into the 1490s, the war for Granada became less about lightning raids or heroic cavalry charges, and more about something colder, slower, and far more devastating: siege warfare. Ferdinand and Isabella, pragmatic to their core, understood that they didn't need to storm Granada in one daring assault. They had the manpower, the resources, and the artillery to grind it down fortress by fortress, town by town, until the kingdom shrank to nothing. It was a campaign of attrition, and their main weapons were hunger, fear, and fire. Granada's geography, with its mountains and fertile valleys, lent itself to defense, but siege warfare changed the rules. The Christians had learned from their neighbors in Italy, and from earlier wars in Europe, how to use gunpowder artillery, effective, massive cannons, hauled laboriously over rough terrain by oxen and teams of soldiers, could now batter down walls that once seemed unassailable. Towers that had stood for centuries crumbled under repeated bombardments. Thick stone gates splintered after days of cannon fire. For the defenders, who had long relied on the strength of their fortresses, the sight of walls collapsing under iron shot was terrifying. A reminder that old strategies no longer sufficed in a world reshaped by gunpowder. One by one, the Christians targeted the outer towns of the kingdom. Ronda, Loja, Vélez Málaga, Malaga itself, Each became the focus of Ferdinand and Isabella's methodical campaigns. They encircled towns, cut off supplies, and hammered them with artillery until defenders either surrendered or faced starvation. The fall of Malaga in 1487 was especially brutal. The city resisted fiercely, its defenders hoping that aid from North Africa might arrive. When it didn't, famine gnawed at the population. When the Christians finally broke through, they exacted a harsh price. Thousands were enslaved or executed, and the city was resettled with loyal Castilian colonists. The message was clear: resistance meant ruin. The scorched earth policy was another tool in Ferdinand and Isabella's arsenal. Rather than always attempting to storm heavily defended positions, their armies often burned fields, orchards, and villages in the countryside, ensuring that even if a fortress held, its people would starve. Cavalry patrols swept across the Vega of Granada, torching crops and poisoning wells. Smoke rose constantly on the horizon, visible from the Alhambra's towers. For the citizens of Granada, every plume of smoke was a reminder that their lifeline to food was shrinking. The Christians also made clever use of blockades. With Malaga lost, Granada's access to the sea was crippled. Ports that once carried goods from North Africa now sat under watch or were in enemy hands. The Mediterranean connection, so vital for trade and morale, dwindled. The Nasrids tried to run supplies across the mountains, but the Christians built fortified encampments to intercept them. Slowly the kingdom was strangled, its territory shrinking like cloth unraveling from a spool. What made these sieges particularly effective was the establishment of permanent Christian bases. Instead of raiding and withdrawing, Ferdinand and Isabella planted new towns, fortified with walls and towers, right on Granada's doorstep. The most famous was Santa Fe, constructed in 1491 during the final siege of Granada itself. This was not merely a military camp, it was a statement of permanence. The Christians were not leaving. They intended to stay until the city fell. For the Granadans, watching a whole new town rise outside their walls was a crushing psychological blow. Inside besieged towns, conditions were horrific. Food supplies dwindled quickly once fields were lost. Bread was rationed to crumbs, meat vanished, and people resorted to eating roots, boiled leather, even stray animals. Disease followed hunger, as malnutrition weakened immune systems, and crowded conditions spread infections. Parents faced the nightmare of watching their children starve, knowing there was no relief. For many towns, surrender became less about politics and more about survival. Better to yield and hope for mercy than to watch an entire community waste away. The psychological toll was immense. For centuries, Muslims in Iberia had believed that their faith would endure, that their cities were protected by God and tradition. Now each collapsing wall and each starving family tested that faith. Clerics urged perseverance, invoking the duty of jihad, but even the most devout could not ignore the rumbling of empty stomachs. Rumors spread that God had abandoned them, that Granada's sins had brought this punishment. Fear and despair seeped into daily life, eroding the will to resist. Meanwhile, on the Christian side, the sieges were grueling but far more manageable. Their armies were sustained by a steady flow of supplies from Castile and Aragon, financed by taxation and loans. Ferdinand and Isabella oversaw logistics carefully, ensuring that their soldiers were paid and fed. Camp life was harsh, mud, disease, and long stretches of boredom, but soldiers knew they were part of something larger. Each victory was celebrated across Spain, with church bells ringing and sermons praising God's triumph. The sense of divine mission kept morale strong even through long campaigns. Perhaps the most demoralizing weapon of all, however, was time. Ferdinand and Isabella understood that Granada did not need to be taken overnight. Every month that passed drained its resources, thinned its population, and eroded its unity. They could afford to wait, knowing their armies were stronger and their resources deeper. For the people of Granada, time was the enemy. Each season brought more burned crops, more refugees, more hunger. And yet, despite all this, Granada still endured. The city's walls loomed strong, the Alhambra still gleamed, and the Nasrid court still clung to power. Every victory for Ferdinand and Isabella was hard won, each fortress requiring months of labor and lives. Granada did not fall easily. It resisted with stubbornness, with faith, and with the sheer resilience of its people. But the trend was unmistakable. Siege by siege, blockade by blockade, the kingdom shrank. Imagine standing on Granada's walls during one of these sieges. The air is filled with smoke from enemy fires. You can hear the distant thunder of cannons, each boom shaking the earth. At night you see the glow of Christian campfires stretching across the plain, more numerous than stars. Inside the city, families huddle together, whispering prayers, while soldiers pace the battlements with weary eyes. Hunger gnaws at you, fear presses in, but still you stand because surrender feels like betrayal, and resistance is all you have left. Siege warfare was not glorious. It was not about heroic charges or noble duels. It was about endurance, about who could last longer before breaking. And in this grim contest, Ferdinand and Isabella had every advantage. Granada's fate was being decided not in one grand battle, but in a slow strangulation, a war of walls and stomachs. The final act was approaching, but already, by the late 1480s, the outcome was clear. Granada was a kingdom under siege, not only by armies but by inevitability. Its defences, once so proud, were crumbling under the weight of artillery. Its fields, once so fertile, were blackened with fire. Its people, once so vibrant, were reduced to hunger and despair. Siege warfare had turned the jewel of Al-Andalus into a cage, and the cage was closing tighter every day. Behind Granada's walls, while Ferdinand and Isabella's armies hammered the countryside and encircled the capital, life for the ordinary people grew increasingly desperate. It is easy to focus on kings, generals, and fortresses when telling the story of the Reconquista, but the real weight of the war fell on the shoulders of the civilians, farmers, merchants, artisans, and children, who bore the hunger, fear, and uncertainty of a city under siege. Their experience reveals not just the collapse of a kingdom, but the human cost of its final days. Imagine waking each morning to the echo of distant cannon fire. The walls of Granada groan with every impact, and the air smells faintly of smoke drifting in from the burning plains beyond. You walk through the narrow, winding alleys of the Albaycin, the city's Muslim quarter, and see families clutching meager loaves of bread, women drawing water from communal fountains with hollow eyes, and children whose laughter has been replaced by thin cries for food. The once bustling markets are quiet. Merchant stalls that once overflowed with silk, spices, and figs now stand nearly empty. What little remains, dried beans, rough bread, rancid oil, fetches prices so high that only the wealthy can afford them. Hunger became the defining feature of daily life. With Christian armies torching fields and blockading routes, food could no longer flow freely into the city. Refugees from conquered towns only added to the strain, crowding into already packed homes and begging for sustenance. Rations grew smaller by the week. Families boiled weeds for soup, ground acorns into flour, or scavenged scraps from refuse. Chroniclers describe people eating horseflesh, leather straps, even stray cats and dogs. Famine gnawed at every belly, sparing no one, though the poor suffered most. Disease followed closely behind hunger. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, while cramped living conditions made epidemics inevitable. Fevers swept through neighborhoods, claiming the very young and the very old. Mosques and bathhouses, once places of spiritual and physical renewal, became makeshift infirmaries. The city, famed for its fountains and gardens, stank of illness and decay. Funeral prayers became a daily rhythm, with cemeteries filling faster than ever. And yet, amid this misery, people clung to ritual and faith. The mosques of Granada remained full, even when bread baskets were empty. Clerics urged perseverance, reminding worshippers that jihad meant more than fighting on the battlefield. It meant enduring suffering with patience and dignity. The call to prayer echoed across the rooftops, a reminder that even in hunger and fear, life retained meaning. Families gathered in candlelit rooms to recite the Quran, drawing comfort from words older than the city itself. In this sense, faith became a form of resistance. If the body could be starved, the soul refused to surrender. Not everyone responded with such quiet resilience. Desperation sometimes drove people to crime or betrayal. Food riots broke out, with mobs looting storehouses or attacking merchants accused of hoarding. Rumors spread of spies within the city, secretly working for Ferdinand and Isabella. Some nobles were accused of stockpiling grain while the poor starved, further deepening resentment toward the Nasrid dynasty. Trust eroded, and suspicion hung in the air. For many ordinary Granadans, the greatest enemy was not only the Christian army outside the walls, but the corruption and incompetence of their own rulers. Children, too, bore scars that would never heal. For them, The war was the only life they knew. A child born in 1482, when the war began, reached the age of 10 by the final surrender in 40. Those were 10 years of flight, hunger, and terror. 10 years of seeing fathers leave for the walls and never return. 10 years of mothers bartering away heirlooms for handfuls of grain. Their lullabies were the thunder of cannons. Their playgrounds the rubble of collapsed houses. An entire generation of Granadans came of age in the shadow of war, their childhoods devoured by a conflict they could not understand. Refugees filled every corner of the city. When Christian armies captured towns like Malaga, Loja, or Baza, thousands fled to Granada, carrying nothing but clothes on their backs and the trauma of conquest. They crowded into the Albayacin, into courtyards and alleys, swelling the population beyond capacity. Houses meant for one family now held 3 or 4. Entire neighborhoods turned into refugee camps, with smoke from small fires curling into the night air. Their stories of massacres, enslavement and destruction spread fear among the city's residents, painting a picture of what might await if Granada itself fell. Even amid desperation, there were moments of quiet normalcy. Artisans continued to carve wood, weave cloth, and paint tiles, though in smaller numbers. Poets still composed verses, some of lament, others of hope. Weddings and births still occurred, though they were subdued, their joy tempered by the knowledge of war. People clung to these small rituals, not because they could change the outcome, but because they reminded them of life before the siege. To host a wedding, to sing a song, to recite a poem, these acts were defiances of despair, proof that humanity endured even when walls crumbled. Women bore particular burdens. With men often called to the walls or killed in fighting, women kept households alive under impossible conditions. They stood in long lines for water, scavenged for food, and cared for the sick. Many took in orphaned children, expanding already strained households. Their resilience kept families and neighborhoods from collapsing entirely. Stories from the time recall mothers who went without food for days so their children might eat, women who sold treasured jewelry for a few sacks of grain, and widows who became community leaders in the absence of men. As the siege dragged on, fear of betrayal grew. Everyone remembered Boabdil's capture and release by Ferdinand years earlier, and whispers spread that he might be negotiating again. Some citizens prayed for a negotiated peace, hoping to avoid the fate of Malaga, while others demanded total resistance. The divide created tension in the city between those who wanted to surrender with dignity and those who vowed to fight to the last. For ordinary people, this debate was agonizing. Was it braver to endure hunger in the name of faith, or to protect one's children by yielding? From the walls of Granada, the sight of the enemy was constant. The Christian campfires stretched for miles across the plain, flickering like a second constellation beneath the stars. By 1491, the construction of Santa Fe, a permanent Christian town just outside the city, drove home the reality. The Christians weren't leaving. Every day, civilians looked out and saw not an army that would march away, but a new settlement planted like a thorn in the Vega, a symbol of permanence. The message was cruelly clear. Granada's days were numbered. And yet, even as hope waned, the people endured. Children still played, chasing each other through alleys with sticks for swords. Families still gathered at night, telling stories of Córdoba and Seville, of the days when Al-Andalus stretched across the land. Mosques still called the faithful to prayer, their voices rising defiantly into the smoky air. Life inside Granada, under siege, was harsh, cruel, and heartbreaking, but it was also resilient, marked by small acts of defiance against despair. The civilians of Granada were not generals, not kings, not chroniclers, but they were the ones who carried the weight of the war. Their hunger, their fear, their stubborn endurance defined the final years of Al-Andalus. When we remember the fall of Granada, we remember treaties, battles, and monarchs. But behind all that were ordinary people, caught between history and survival, who faced every day with empty stomachs and unbroken spirit. At the heart of Granada's final decade stood one man whose name is inseparable from the kingdom's fate, Mohammed XII, better known by his Spanish nickname, Boabdil. To his supporters, he was a figure of tragic courage, a young ruler trying to hold together a crumbling state. To his critics, both then and now, he was weak, indecisive, and unlucky, an emblem of Granada's collapse. Whether hero or villain, Boabdil became the last sultan of Al-Andalus, carrying the weight of centuries on his shoulders. as his city tottered on the edge of defeat. Boabdil's path to power was forged in the chaos of family rivalry. His father, Abul Hassan Ali, Muli Hassan, had ruled with determination but failed to stop Christian advances. As defeat after defeat sapped his legitimacy, factions within Granada rallied around his son. Boabdil, young and ambitious, seized his chance. In 1482 he declared himself sultan, briefly ousting his father, yet his victory only deepened divisions. Some nobles saw him as a fresh start, others denounced him as a usurper. The city itself was split, with different neighborhoods flying banners for different rulers. It was the first sign of what would define his reign, the inability to unify his kingdom under one vision. Almost immediately, Boabdil's fortunes soured. Later that same year, eager to prove himself against the Christians, he led an army into battle near Lucena. It was a disaster. The Granadan forces were routed, and Boabdil himself was captured, taken prisoner by Ferdinand of Aragon. He faced a choice: die in captivity or bargain for release. He chose the latter. The terms were humiliating. He pledged homage to Ferdinand and promised to pay tribute, effectively acknowledging himself as a vassal of Castile. Worse, he agreed to surrender certain territories if demanded. In return, Ferdinand released him, calculating that Boabdil would destabilize Granada further by clashing with his father and uncle. The gamble worked. Boabdil returned to Granada with a stain of collaboration on his name. Many saw him as a pawn of the Christians, a man willing to sell out his people for a throne. His father and uncle El Zagal both contested his rule, leading to years of infighting. Instead of uniting against Ferdinand and Isabella, the Nasrids wasted precious energy in civil war, while their enemies patiently picked off towns and fortresses. Boabdil's nickname, El Zogobi, the Unlucky, began to feel prophetic. Still, it would be unfair to see him only as a puppet. Boabdil genuinely tried to navigate an impossible situation. He knew the strength of Castile and Aragon, and understood that outright defiance might mean total destruction. At times he leaned toward negotiation, hoping to preserve autonomy for his people, even if it meant acknowledging Christian overlordship. At other times, pressured by hardliners in Granada, he rallied the city to resist. But this oscillation between compromise and defiance left him distrusted by both sides. To Ferdinand and Isabella, he was unreliable. To his own people, he was unsteady. The psychological burden on Boabdil must have been crushing. Imagine being in your 20s, ruling a city whose history stretches back centuries, knowing that you are the last line between survival and annihilation. Every decision he made carried the weight of Al-Andalus. Surrender too much, and he would be branded a traitor. Resist too fiercely, and he risked bringing down destruction on his people. His hesitations, his compromises, and his attempts at balance reflect not simply weakness, but the impossible position of a man trapped between history's grinding gears. Inside Granada, Boabdil's rule was a source of constant debate. In the Alhambra's halls, nobles argued bitterly, some urging him to stand firm, others pressing for negotiation. Clerics called for jihad, framing resistance as a sacred duty. Merchants facing economic ruin begged for peace at any price. Refugees filled the streets, their presence a reminder of what surrender or conquest might bring. Boabdil listened to them all, and in trying to please everyone, often satisfied no one. His family life mirrored his political struggles. His mother, Aixa, was a formidable figure, fiercely protective of her son, and openly hostile toward his father and uncle. Chroniclers describe her as whispering in Boabdil's ear, urging him never to yield fully to the Christians. Yet even her influence could not provide the clear path forward he so desperately needed. Instead, he was caught between her fiery resolve and the pragmatic voices urging compromise. To the Christian chroniclers, Boabdil was a convenient foil. They portrayed him as indecisive, weak, and fated to fail, a man embodying the decline of Muslim power in Spain. His capture and release at Lucena became a symbol of his supposed cowardice. Yet some Christian accounts also show grudging respect for his dignity, especially at the moment of Granada's surrender. In him they saw not a mighty warrior, but a tragic prince, presiding over the twilight of his people's rule. The ordinary people of Granada, however, likely saw him in harsher terms. For them, he was the ruler presiding over hunger, siege, and suffering. His inability to unify the kingdom meant more burned fields, more lost battles, more refugees. His promises of relief often went unfulfilled. His His negotiations with the Christians brought no lasting peace, and his leadership offered little solace. For the citizens watching their children starve, Boabdil must have seemed less a tragic hero and more a symbol of their despair. Yet history rarely allows us the simplicity of heroes and villains. Boabdil's tragedy was that he was born at the wrong time, placed in a role where every choice was poisoned. Had he ruled in an earlier age, he might have been remembered as a cautious, pragmatic sultan who preserved Granada through diplomacy. But in the 1480s and 1490s, there was no preserving Granada. Ferdinand and Isabella were too powerful, too determined, and too united. The Reconquista was more than a war, it was destiny for the Christian kingdoms. Against that tide, Boabdil was a single man with a divided court, a starving city, and an exhausted people. When he finally surrendered Granada in January 1492, handing over the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella, he cemented his place in history. Some saw it as betrayal, others as mercy. His famous retreat, weeping as he looked back at his lost city from the mountains, gave rise to the legendary Moor's sigh. His mother is said to have rebuked him, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Whether she truly said it or not, the story reflects how posterity judged him, unlucky, hesitant, remembered less for what he did than for what he lost. Boabdil's reign was defined by contradictions. He resisted, yet he negotiated. He fought, yet he yielded. He sought to preserve his people, yet presided over their fall. In him we see not only the flaws of a man, but the tragedy of a kingdom whose time had run out. He was not strong enough to save Granada, but perhaps no one could have been. Standing in the Alhambra today, among the carved verses praising paradise, it is easy to imagine Boabdil pacing those same courtyards, torn between pride and despair, knowing that the weight of centuries pressed upon him. He remains the face of Granada's last chapter, not because he shaped its destiny, but because he was trapped by it. By the late 1480s, the noose around Granada had tightened to the point of suffocation. Ferdinand and Isabella, relentless in their strategy, had shifted from opportunistic raids to a steady, organized advance across Andalusia, swallowing the Nasrid kingdom piece by piece. Each campaign was carefully chosen, not only for its military value, but also for its symbolic weight. Town by town, fortress by fortress, the last Muslim kingdom was reduced until only the capital itself remained. For the people of Granada, the advance was like watching the walls of their world crumble inward, knowing there was nowhere left to run. The Christian monarchs approached the conquest with remarkable discipline. Their armies no longer relied on short bursts of campaigning limited to summer months. Instead, they maintained year-round pressure, fueled by a taxation system that kept supplies moving and soldiers paid. Ferdinand, shrewd and pragmatic, oversaw logistics with military precision. Isabella, equally determined, traveled with the army, offering spiritual encouragement and symbolizing divine sanction for the cause. Chroniclers paint her as a queen who rode among the camps, inspiring loyalty and framing the war as a sacred mission. Together they embodied the unity and purpose that the fractured Nasrid so desperately lacked. The capture of Malaga in 1487 was a turning point. It was not merely a city, it was the jewel of Granada's Mediterranean coast, a vital port connecting the kingdom to North Africa and beyond. Its fall severed the Nasrids from the outside world. No longer could they count on reinforcements, supplies, or even moral support from Muslim dynasties across the sea. Malaga's population paid dearly for its resistance. Thousands were enslaved, others executed, and the city repopulated with Christians. Word of this harsh fate spread quickly, serving as a grim warning to other towns. Some, terrified of Malaga's example, began to surrender more readily rather than face annihilation. Next came Basel, captured in 1489 after a grueling siege. This city, strategically perched in the eastern part of the kingdom, represented one of Granada's strongest fortifications. Its defenders resisted valiantly, but after months of hunger and bombardment, they yielded. Boabdil himself played a role here, negotiating with the Christians in hopes of securing lenient terms. Once again, his pragmatism, some called it weakness, angered hardliners in Granada, who believed surrender was dishonor. Yet the surrender of Basel marked another major loss. Without it, Granada's control of its eastern provinces collapsed, leaving the capital even more isolated. Each victory for Ferdinand and Isabella was carefully documented and celebrated. Chroniclers compared their conquests to biblical triumphs, casting them as new Davids defeating Goliath, or as God's chosen instruments cleansing Spain of unbelief. Bells rang across Castile and Aragon with every fortress taken. Priests preached sermons extolling the monarch's divine mission. Soldiers, spurred on by both faith and the lure of spoils, grew ever more convinced that God himself marched with them. For Granada, this psychological warfare was as damaging as the cannons. Their enemies did not merely fight for land, they fought with the conviction that heaven was on their side. For ordinary Muslims in Granada's towns and countryside, the steady advance of the Christians meant despair. Each captured town sent waves of refugees into the capital, carrying horror stories of massacres, enslavement, and broken families. The Albayacin, Granada's Muslim quarter, grew crowded with the displaced. Families slept in courtyards, alleys, and even in mosques, clinging to hope that the capital's walls would protect them. But as more towns fell, even that hope seemed fragile. Every victory for the Christians meant another flood of gaunt, weary faces telling tales of fire and ruin. Inside the capital, morale fluctuated wildly. Some argued that the city must fight to the last, preserving honor even in defeat. Others urged negotiation, pointing to the destruction of Malaga as proof of what stubborn resistance might bring. Boabdil leaned often toward compromise, seeking to save lives through diplomacy, while his rivals denounced him as cowardly. The people were caught between these competing visions, unsure whether to trust in arms or in treaties. Fear and hunger sharpened every debate, turning political arguments into desperate cries for survival. The Christian advance also showcased the power of artillery, a technology that fundamentally reshaped warfare. Granada's fortresses, designed in an earlier era, were no match for sustained bombardment. Towers crumbled, walls split open, and once proud gates lay in ruins after days of cannon fire. Defenders who had once trusted in the strength of stone now faced the terrifying realization that no wall was impregnable. The thunder of artillery became the soundtrack of Granada's final years, each boom a reminder that old defenses were obsolete. By 1490 the Nasrid kingdom was reduced to little more than Granada itself and its immediate surroundings. The once expansive domain that had stretched across much of Andalusia was gone. Córdoba, Seville, and Toledo had long since fallen. Now, Malaga, Baza, and countless other towns were lost. What remained was a single city, magnificent but besieged, standing alone against a united Spain. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the endgame was clear. For the people of Granada, the advance had become a nightmare, an unstoppable tide sweeping away their world. The Christians' careful method was part of what made their conquest so devastating. They did not gamble on risky battles. They suffocated Granada slowly, ensuring that each victory was secure before moving on. Their ability to maintain year-round campaigns, unlike earlier medieval armies, was decisive. It meant the Nasrids had no breathing space, no chance to regroup. Siege followed siege, surrender followed surrender, until the capital was isolated like a lone island in a hostile sea. To understand what this felt like for Granada's people, imagine standing on the Alhambra's towers and looking out across the Vega, where once fields of wheat and orchards of pomegranates stretched in abundance. Now blackened ruins scar the land. Villages lie abandoned, their people either fled or enslaved. In the distance, Christian encampments glimmer with torchlight, their banners fluttering confidently. The world you once knew fertile, prosperous, secure, is gone, replaced by a landscape of fire and conquest. Even in its reduced state, Granada still dazzled. The Alhambra's courtyards echoed with fountains, its walls shimmered with intricate calligraphy, and poets continued to write verses of longing and resilience. But beauty could not stop the advance. The Christians were patient, systematic, and relentless. And each day that passed, the circle tightened, the options dwindled, and the end drew nearer. By the eve of 1491, the Christian advance had done its work. Granada, the last jewel of Al-Andalus, stood alone. Its ruler, Boabdil, faced impossible choices. Its people, weary from hunger and fear, clung to faith, but could no longer deny the inevitable. The advance of Ferdinand and Isabella had been not only military but psychological, convincing everyone, Christians and Muslims alike, that the fall of Granada was only a matter of time. Granada was no longer a kingdom. It was a single city surrounded by enemies, its fate already written in the smoke rising from the plains. By 1491, the Reconquista had become a closing act, and the stage was set for the final siege of Granada. The city, long admired for its beauty and strength, was reduced to a single stronghold surrounded by an ocean of Christian banners. Ferdinand and Isabella had taken nearly every other town of the Nasrid kingdom, only Granada itself remained. The Catholic monarchs knew that their triumph was inevitable, but they also understood that this last chapter must be carefully managed. The fall of Granada would not simply end a war, it would mark the symbolic completion of centuries of Christian struggle against Islam in Iberia, and so they moved with the patience of predators, surrounding the city in a siege unlike any before it. The decision to besiege Granada rather than storm it outright reflected both caution and confidence. Ferdinand and Isabella had no desire to lose thousands of soldiers in bloody street fighting. They had artillery, they had manpower, and most importantly, they had time. By starving the city, cutting it off from every possible source of aid, they could force Boabdil and his people to surrender on their terms. This was not to be a swift, dramatic battle, but a slow strangulation. In the spring of 1491, Christian forces encircled the capital. Chroniclers describe a vast host of soldiers, nobles, clergy, and even camp followers covering the plain of the Vega. Thousands of tents dotted the landscape, banners of Castile and Aragon snapping in the wind, their crosses visible from the Alhambra's towers. The sight must have been terrifying for the people of Granada, an endless sea of enemies camped at their very gates. At night, fires from the Christian camp glowed like a second city, stretching farther than the eye could see. But Ferdinand and Isabella did more than camp. When a fire accidentally destroyed much of their temporary encampment, they decided to build something extraordinary, an entire town, constructed in stone and brick, to serve as a permanent base for the siege. They named it Santa Fe, Holy Faith. Within weeks, walls, houses, and churches rose on the plain, a new town born from the war. Its construction carried a message that was impossible to ignore. The Christians were not leaving. They were planting roots in the very soil of Granada's kingdom, a settlement that said, "We are here until the end." Inside the city, the people endured with a mix of courage and despair. Food was already scarce, and now the siege made it nearly impossible to bring in supplies. Prices soared. A loaf of bread became a luxury. Hunger gnawed at every family. Refugees who had fled from other towns added to the pressure, swelling the population beyond what the city could sustain. Disease followed, spreading through the crowded Albayacin quarter. Every day, funerals wound their way through the alleys, solemn prayers drifting into the smoky air. Still, there was resilience. Mosques echoed with sermons urging perseverance, reminding believers of the rewards of steadfastness. Families pooled resources, neighbors supported one another, and faith became the final defense. The Alhambra's courtyards, with their fountains still murmuring softly, became places of quiet resolve, where soldiers and citizens alike reminded themselves of the city's long history of survival. Yet, beneath the resolve, was dread. Everyone knew that no help was coming. North Africa, once a lifeline, was too divided to intervene. The Ottomans, powerful in the east, were too far away. Granada was alone. For Boabdil, the pressure was crushing. As the siege tightened, he faced growing calls from some nobles and clerics to resist to the last man. Others, weary of suffering, begged him to negotiate. He vacillated between the two, as he always had. One day he spoke of defiance, the next of compromise. His mother, Isa, pushed him toward resistance, urging him to preserve honor. Yet his pragmatism told him that resistance would mean only slaughter. The example of Malaga haunted him, its population enslaved, its city repopulated with Christians. Was that to be Granada's fate? The Christian camp at Santa Fe was not only a military base, it was also a diplomatic theatre. Ferdinand and Isabella knew they could win by patience, but they preferred to secure a formal surrender, one that would legitimize their victory and demonstrate their magnanimity. And so, even as their cannons pounded Granada's walls and their soldiers tightened the blockade, they opened channels of negotiation. Boabdil sent envoys, testing the waters, trying to salvage what dignity and security he could for his people. The negotiations dragged on for months, with terms proposed and rejected, demands made and softened. The Christians held all the cards, but they understood the value of appearing merciful. By offering relatively generous terms, they hoped to secure Granada without a final bloody assault, and to present themselves to Europe as noble rulers who had completed the Reconquista with honor. The Pope himself watched eagerly, expecting the triumph to be framed as a holy victory. Inside Granada, the psychological war was just as intense as the physical one. Each day of hunger, each night of cannon fire, eroded the will to resist. Mothers whispered to their children that peace might soon come, that the Christians would show mercy. Fathers argued in the markets about whether Boabdil should yield. Clerics preached fiery sermons against surrender, but even their words could not fill empty stomachs. The longer the siege dragged on, the more the balance tipped toward negotiation. The spectacle of the Christian camp was impossible to ignore. From the Alhambra's towers, Granadans could see Santa Fe growing each week, houses, walls, and churches rising as if to mock the city's plight. It was a city of the future replacing the city of the past, a symbol of permanence against impermanence. That sight, perhaps more than the cannons, convinced many that Granada's fall was inevitable. By autumn of 1491 it was clear to everyone, Boabdil, his nobles, his people, that the end was near. The negotiations accelerated. Terms were discussed that would guarantee religious freedom, protect mosques, allow Muslims to retain property, and permit those who wished to emigrate to North Africa to do so. On paper it seemed almost generous, a surrender that preserved dignity. Many Granadans, exhausted by years of war, accepted this as the best possible outcome. Others still muttered that it was dishonor, that death was preferable to submission, but hunger silenced their voice. Picture the city in those last months. Gaunt faces in the streets, thin children clutching their mothers' hands, men too weak to lift swords pacing the walls. The fountains of the Alhambra still murmur, but their beauty feels ghostly, out of place in a city collapsing from within. Beyond the walls, the fires of Santa Fe glow steadily, unshaken, eternal, and above it all, the cannons continue to thunder, reminding everyone that time is not on Granada's side. The final siege of Granada was not a single climactic battle, but a slow, grinding suffocation. It was war by patience, war by inevitability. By December 1491, the negotiations had reached their conclusion. The city would surrender. The war that had begun in 1482, the Reconquista that had lasted for centuries, was about to end. The people of Granada had endured famine, fire, and fear. Now they would face something different, the uncertain mercy of their conquerors. As the siege of Granada dragged into the end of 1491, the question was no longer if the city would fall, but how. Boabdil, weary from years of impossible choices, finally opened full negotiations with Ferdinand and Isabella. What followed was one of the most remarkable diplomatic processes of the age, a bargaining session in which the fate of an entire civilization in Spain was decided. While cannons still thundered against the city walls and hunger haunted its people, envoys moved between the Alhambra and Santa Fe, carrying proposals, counter-proposals, and the heavy burden of compromise. The Catholic monarchs understood the importance of appearances. They could, if they wished, have annihilated Granada by force, turning it into another Malaga, a city emptied, its inhabitants enslaved or scattered. But they also saw an opportunity to frame their conquest, not as mere conquest, but as a magnanimous act of Christian justice. By offering terms that looked generous, they would demonstrate their virtue to all of Europe, strengthen their legitimacy in the eyes of the Pope, and make their triumph shine as both a political and moral victory. For Boabdil, the negotiations were a desperate attempt to salvage dignity. He knew resistance was impossible. The city was starving, morale broken, walls crumbling. His people were exhausted, his nobles divided, and no aid would come from North Africa or the Ottomans. Yet surrender without conditions would mean disaster. He needed guarantees of religious freedom, of property rights, of safe passage for those who wished to leave. Even if Granada's independence could not be saved, perhaps the lives and culture of its people could. The resulting treaty, hammered out over weeks of tense exchanges, came to be known as the Capitulations of Granada. On parchment at least, they promised extraordinary protections. Muslims would be allowed to continue practicing their faith openly. Mosques would remain intact. The call to prayer would still echo from their minarets, and Islamic judges would continue to administer the law in family and civil matters. Property and land would remain in Muslim hands. Taxes would not be raised unfairly, and those who wished to emigrate across the sea to North Africa would be permitted to do so freely. Even freedom of dress, language, and customs was guaranteed. To modernize, the treaty reads almost like a blueprint for tolerance. For the people of Granada in 1491, it was a lifeline. Better this, they reasoned, than annihilation. Compared to the horrors of Malaga, the capitulations offered hope of survival, of continuity, of life after surrender. Chroniclers describe citizens, worn down by famine and fear, whispering relief that at least they might keep their mosques, their families, their traditions. The terms sounded merciful, merciful enough that many Granadans accepted surrender as the lesser evil. The negotiations themselves were a strange theatre. On one side, Ferdinand and Isabella presented themselves as stern but benevolent rulers, offering mercy to those who bent the knee. On the other side, Boabdil's envoys bowed and bargained, careful to maintain dignity even as they conceded point after point. Letters flew back and forth, clauses were debated, conditions refined. It was a game in which everyone knew the outcome, yet both sides played their parts with gravity. One condition particularly important to Boabdil was the guarantee of safe passage. He asked that those unwilling to live under Christian rule be allowed to emigrate to North Africa with their families and possessions. Ferdinand and Isabella agreed. For many nobles and merchants this was critical. They could keep their wealth and escape to Morocco or Fez, starting anew under Muslim rulers. For the common people, it offered less comfort. Few had the means to uproot their lives, but still, the option gave some sense of choice in the face of inevitable loss. It is worth pausing here to note the extraordinary tone of the treaty. The capitulations were couched in language of respect, promising not only tolerance but honor. The Catholic monarchs pledged their royal word, sworn before God, to uphold the conditions. To the people of Granada, weary and desperate, such oaths carried weight. Surely, they believed, rulers who had spoken so solemnly would keep their promises. And yet, history tells us that these promises were fragile, destined to be broken. Within a decade, the capitulations of Granada would be violated repeatedly. Pressure from clergy, particularly figures like Cardinal Cisneros, led to forced conversions, destruction of mosques and persecution of Muslims who resisted baptism. By the early 16th century, Islam was effectively outlawed in Spain, and the Muslim population, now called Moriscos after conversion, was subject to surveillance, suspicion, and eventually expulsion. The capitulations that once seemed merciful became a bitter memory, a symbol of broken trust. But in late 1491, as negotiations concluded, none of that was yet apparent. To the people of Granada, the treaty seemed like salvation. It was the difference between survival and slaughter, between cultural continuity and annihilation. For Boabdil, it was the best he could achieve. A final act of leadership for a doomed kingdom. Better to surrender with terms than to let his people suffer. Malaga's fate. The atmosphere in Granada as the terms were announced must have been one of strange relief mixed with grief. Families wept with the knowledge that their independence was gone, but also sighed with relief that their mosques and homes would remain. Some began preparing for emigration, selling possessions, arranging journeys across the Mediterranean. Others clung stubbornly to the city, unwilling to abandon the land of their ancestors. Everywhere, people debated whether surrender was betrayal or wisdom, whether Boabdil had saved them or doomed them. In Santa Fe, Ferdinand and Isabella prepared for their triumph. Their court chroniclers already drafted celebratory accounts, framing the conquest as the crowning achievement of their reign. The papacy sent blessings, and across Europe, anticipation grew. The fall of Granada would not be seen merely as the end of a war, but as the fulfillment of prophecy. Christendom had reclaimed Spain. For the Catholic monarchs, the treaty was not a compromise but a trophy, proof of their piety and their power. Picture those last days of 1491. In the Alhambra, envoys hurry back and forth, their footsteps echoing in the tiled courtyards. Nobles sit in hushed chambers, debating whether to leave or stay. Families pack bundles, clutching heirlooms and scrolls, wondering if they will see their homes again. In the Christian camp, priests bless the soldiers, promising them eternal glory for their role in God's work. And in Santa Fe, the new stone churches ring with bells announcing the impending victory. The capitulations of Granada were signed in late November 1491. They represented not only the surrender of a city, but the end of an era. For centuries, Al-Andalus had been a beacon of learning, culture, and faith. Now, with ink on parchment, that world was extinguished. What remained was survival, fragile, conditional, and soon to be betrayed. For Boabdil, the treaty was both his last act of power and the seal of his legacy. For Ferdinand and Isabella, it was the final step in a century-long crusade. For the people of Granada, it was a lifeline, fragile but precious, clutched desperately in trembling hands. The cannons fell silent. The siege was over. Now, all that remained was the formal surrender, the moment when Boabdil would hand over the keys of Granada, ending 8 centuries of Muslim rule in Spain. The dawn of January 2, 1492, arrived cold and pale over the Vega of Granada, and with it came one of the most dramatic spectacles in European history, the formal surrender of the city. After months of siege and weeks of delicate negotiation, the time had come for Boabdil to hand over the keys of his kingdom to Ferdinand and Isabella. What unfolded that day was not merely a political act, but a carefully orchestrated ceremony, choreographed to broadcast triumph, legitimacy, and symbolism to the watching world. It was the theatrical finale to the centuries-long Reconquista, and everyone present understood its weight. At first light, Christian soldiers moved into position, their banners bright crosses of Castile and Aragon, snapped in the cold winter air. The hills and plains around the city bristled with steel, a sea of spears, swords and armor gleaming in the sun. Priests raised crucifixes high, their chants rolling across the plain. Trumpets blared, drums pounded, and the Christian camp swelled with anticipation. For Ferdinand and Isabella, this was the crowning moment of their reign, the conquest of Granada, the completion of Spain. Inside the city, the atmosphere was altogether different. Families pressed to the walls, straining to see the procession that would mark the end of their world. Mothers clutched children to their chests, whispering prayers. Men bowed their heads in mosques, murmuring verses of the Quran for strength. Some wept openly, others stared silently, too numb for tears. The Alhambra's fountains still bubbled softly, but their music now seemed like an elegy. For the people of Granada, the day was not victory but grief, a requiem for independence, for dignity, for centuries of Muslim rule in Spain. Boabdil prepared himself for the most painful walk of his life. Dressed in black, as though attending a funeral, he mounted his horse and rode out of the Alhambra with a small retinue. Chroniclers describe his face as pale, his eyes downcast, his shoulders heavy with despair. He carried with him the keys of Granada, symbols of authority over the city, now to be surrendered forever. Each clink of the keys must have felt like the tolling of a bell, announcing not only the death of a kingdom but the end of a world. On the plain outside the city, near the newly built town of Santa Fe, Ferdinand and Isabella waited, seated on raised thrones beneath a great crimson canopy. Around them stood nobles, soldiers and clergy, their expressions proud and solemn. The air was thick with ceremony, every detail designed to reinforce the image of holy triumph. Chroniclers later wrote that even the weather seemed to favor the moment. The skies were clear, the sun shone brightly, and the day carried an aura of destiny fulfilled. Boabdil dismounted before the Catholic monarchs. Slowly, deliberately, he bowed, then handed over the keys. "Take them, O king and queen," he is said to have murmured, "and may God grant you to use them with good fortune." Ferdinand accepted them with practiced dignity, passing them to his son, Prince Juan, symbolizing both conquest and continuity. Trumpets blared again, and the Christian army erupted in cheers. Bells rang out from newly consecrated churches in Santa Fe, their sound carried on the wind to Granada itself. At that moment, Christian banners were raised over the Alhambra. The great red and gold flag of Castile, the white banner of Aragon, and a massive silver cross were unfurled from the towers. For the people watching from within the city, the sight was devastating. The crescent moon that had long flown above Granada was gone, replaced by the symbols of their conquerors. The cross gleamed in the sunlight, visible from miles around, a triumphant proclamation that Christian rule had returned. Chroniclers say that when the banners rose, the cries of the people echoed through the Albayacine sobs, wails, and whispered laments. The surrender was carefully managed to emphasize not only conquest but the fulfillment of prophecy. Priests intoned prayers of thanksgiving, framing the victory as divine will. Nobles kissed the monarch's hands, pledging loyalty. Soldiers fell to their knees, their armor clattering, in thanks to God for completing the Reconquista. To Europe, this was not just a political victory, it was a holy one, a moment to be celebrated from Rome to London. The Catholic monarchs had achieved what generations of kings before them had dreamed of, the expulsion of Muslim power from Spain. And yet, even amid the grandeur of the Christian triumph, the human cost was impossible to ignore. For the citizens of Granada, this was not a ceremony, but a humiliation. They watched their sultan bow to foreign rulers, their banners torn down, their faith and culture suddenly subject to the mercy of conquerors. Though the capitulations promised religious freedom and respect for their traditions, trust was fragile. Many wondered how long those promises would hold. Boabdil's role in the ceremony was both tragic and symbolic. He played his part with dignity, but history would remember him less as a man of courage than as the sultan who surrendered. His nickname, El-Zogobi, the Unlucky, seemed painfully apt. Even as he tried to preserve his people through negotiation, he became the face of their defeat. Chroniclers on both sides agreed that he wept as he departed, his sorrow visible to all. After the formal surrender, Boabdil led his small retinue away from Granada. His destination was the Alpujarras Mountains, where lands had been granted to him as part of the surrender. But as he paused at a high pass, he turned to look back at the city one last time. The sight of the Alhambra, gleaming in the sunlight, broke him. He began to weep. Legend has it that his mother, Isa, rebuked him sharply. "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Whether she truly spoke these words or whether later generations invented them, the story has endured for centuries, symbolizing both Boabdil's personal tragedy and the end of Muslim rule in Spain. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the surrender was not the end, but the beginning of something larger. With Granada secured, they could turn their attention to other grand projects. That very year, 1492, they would finance Christopher Columbus's voyage westward, launching Spain into an age of global empire. The fall of Granada, then, was not only the closing of one chapter, but the opening of another. Europe's expansion into the New World, made possible by the unity and resources of a fully Christian Spain. The surrender of Granada remains one of the most iconic scenes of late medieval Europe, etched into memory, not only through chronicles, but through paintings, poems, and legends. It was at once triumph and tragedy. Triumph for Ferdinand and Isabella, tragedy for Boabdil and his people. On that cold January morning, two worlds overlapped, one rising with confidence, the other fading into memory. For the Christians, the scene was one of joy, bells ringing, and banners flying. For the Muslims of Granada, it was one of sorrow, their city now a stage for someone else's victory. For Boabdil, it was a personal defeat that would define him forever, and for history, it was a turning point. The moment when Al-Andalus, after 8 centuries, ceased to exist. After the trumpets quieted and the banners of Castile and Aragon fluttered above the Alhambra, Granada entered a new phase of existence. On paper, the capitulations of Granada guaranteed a surprisingly generous peace. Muslims were to keep their religion, their mosques, their language, their property, and their customs. Judges could still apply Islamic law to Muslim disputes, and those unwilling to live under Christian rule could emigrate freely to North Africa. The Catholic monarchs promised to govern fairly, to respect the city's inhabitants, and to protect them from harassment. For many Granadans, this offered a fragile sense of reassurance. Though their independence was gone, perhaps their lives and faith could continue. And for a brief moment, those promises seemed real. Ferdinand and Isabella, intent on presenting themselves as merciful conquerors, allowed the city to function with relative autonomy. Mosques remained open, the call to prayer echoed from minarets, and imams still taught Quranic lessons. Muslim families tended their gardens, merchants reopened their stalls, and artisans returned to their craft. In the Albaycin quarter, the rhythm of life, though subdued, carried on. Chroniclers describe the first months after the surrender as strangely peaceful, with Christians and Muslims living side by side, testing the boundaries of this new arrangement. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The Catholic monarchs had no intention of letting Islam endure in Spain forever. For them, the capitulations were a tactical measure, designed to secure Granada's surrender without bloodshed. Their true vision was of a united Christian kingdom, one faith, one crown, one people, and the powerful clergy surrounding them. Particularly figures like Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros saw the toleration of Islam as temporary at best, while some churchmen like Archbishop Hernando de Talavera genuinely favored coexistence and slow conversion through persuasion. Others demanded immediate action. To them, allowing mosques to function was an affront to God, and tolerating Islamic practices was a stain on Spain's newly purified Christian soil. The turning point came quickly. Within a few years of the surrender, efforts to encourage conversion accelerated. At first, Talavera attempted a softer approach. He organized the translation of Christian texts into Arabic, engaged in dialogue with Muslim scholars, and urged patient teaching rather than force. But progress was slow. Most Muslims, understandably, clung to their ancestral faith. Frustrated, Cisneros intervened, a far harsher strategy. Beginning around 1499, he pushed for mass baptisms, often enforced with threats or outright coercion. Mosques were converted into churches, Qurans were confiscated or burned, and resistance was met with violence. The people of Granada, who had trusted the capitulations, felt betrayed. The promises of religious freedom crumbled in less than a decade. Discontent boiled over into open revolt in late 1499. Beginning in the Albaycin quarter, men armed adonets, women hurled stones from rooftops, and cries of defiance echoed through the narrow streets. The rebellion spread into the Alpuxarras mountains, where Muslim peasants rose against Christian officials, determined to defend their faith and tradition. The response was swift and brutal. Ferdinand sent troops to crush the uprising. Villages were burned, rebels slaughtered, and entire communities punished. When the smoke cleared, the Catholic monarchs declared that those who had rebelled had forfeited the protections of the capitulation. From then on, Muslims were faced with a devastating ultimatum: convert to Christianity or face exile. For many, exile was impossible. Poor families lacked the means to cross the Mediterranean. Others could not bear to abandon ancestral homes, farms and graves. So, under pressure, vast numbers converted. These new Christians were known as Moriscos, a term that carried suspicion and stigma. Officially baptized, they were expected to attend church, adopt Christian names, and abandon Islamic practices. Yet, many secretly clung to their faith, praying in hidden rooms, reciting Quranic verses from memory, and whispering the Shahada in the quiet of night. Their existence became one of duality, outwardly Christian, inwardly Muslim. The betrayal of the capitulations sowed deep bitterness. For the Moriscos, every church bell was a reminder of broken promises, every Sunday Mass an act of compulsion. They became second-class citizens in the land they had once ruled, subject to suspicion, taxation, and surveillance. Priests watched them closely, inquisitors probed their loyalties, and neighbors whispered accusations of backsliding into Islam. What had been promised as a peaceful coexistence had turned into a regime of coercion and fear. The Alhambra itself changed. Once the palace of sultans, filled with poetry and music, it now became a Christian royal residence. Crosses were erected where Quranic verses still gleamed in plaster. Chapels were built within its walls. The fountains still murmured, but their surroundings no longer echoed with Arabic verse. To walk its courtyards was to feel the clash of two worlds, the beauty of Islamic art coexisting uneasily with Christian symbols of conquest. And yet, amid these changes, traces of the old Granada endured. The Albaycin remained a neighborhood of winding alleys, Moorish houses, and hidden courtyards. Its people, though officially Christians, carried the memory of their faith in their hearts. The scent of spices, the sound of Arabic lullabies, the design of carved wooden ceilings, all whispered of a culture that refused to vanish entirely. Granada became a city of shadows, its Islamic heritage hidden but alive. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquest of Granada was only the beginning of their grand vision. In 1492, the same year they received the city's keys, they financed Columbus's voyage, launching Spain into a global empire. That same year they issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering all Jews in Spain to convert or leave. The pattern was clear. The Reconquista was not only territorial, but spiritual. Spain would be one faith, one kingdom, no matter the human cost. For the people of Granada, however, the reality was one of grief. The promises made in 1491 had turned to ashes. Within a decade, their mosques were closed, their faith outlawed, their culture suppressed. The capitulations, once seen as salvation, became a bitter memory, a parchment reminder of hope betrayed. Still, the endurance of Granada's people should not be underestimated. For generations, Moriscos secretly passed on Islamic prayers, traditions, and customs. Some even plotted revolts, keeping alive the dream of freedom. Though history records their eventual expulsion in the early 17th century, their legacy endures in Spain's architecture, language, and culture. The fall of Granada was not the end of their influence, but the beginning of a long and painful transformation. Picture the city in those years after conquest. Church bells ringing where the Adhan once echoed. processions of priests winding through streets once filled with Quranic recitation, Moriscos kneeling in churches while silently reciting prayers to Allah, a city outwardly Christian, inwardly haunted by its Muslim past. Granada became a living contradiction, its beauty preserved but its soul scarred. The fall of Granada did not end with the surrender in 1492. Its true legacy lay in the years that followed, in the broken promises, the forced baptisms, the hidden prayers of Moriscos, and the slow erasure of a culture that had flourished for centuries. The banners raised on the Alhambra that January morning symbolized not only victory, but the beginning of a long struggle for survival in the shadows. The fall of Granada in 1492 was hailed across Europe as a triumph of faith. But for the city's Muslims, it marked the beginning of a long and painful afterlife under Christian rule. The initial relief that came with the capitulations of Granada, those fragile promises of tolerance, soon faded into a harsher reality. What followed was not a peaceful coexistence, but a slow, relentless process of assimilation, suspicion, and repression that reshaped Granada and all of Spain. At first outwardly, life seemed to continue much as before. The Albiacine still bustled with activity, artisans still carved wood and shaped ceramics, and merchants continued to sell spices and silks. But beneath the surface, the city was transformed. Christian officials took over the administration, Christian judges replaced Islamic ones in criminal cases, and Christian soldiers patrolled the streets. The Alhambra, once the seat of Nasrid sultans, was occupied by Ferdinand and Isabella. Its Islamic poetry and mosaics still gleamed, but now they stood alongside crucifixes, altars, and chapels. The palace was no longer the symbol of Muslim sovereignty, it was the trophy of Christian conquest. The first real cracks in the capitulations appeared in 1499, just 7 years after the surrender. Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, a fierce advocate for rapid conversion, grew frustrated with the slow pace of Archbishop Talavera's gentler methods. Where Talavera translated Christian teachings into Arabic and preached patiently, Cisneros preferred force. He ordered mass baptisms, destroyed Islamic texts, and pressed nobles to abandon their faith publicly. This heavy-handed approach sparked revolt in the Albiacine, Granada's Muslim quarter. Riots broke out, with citizens arming themselves and barricading the narrow streets. Stones flew from rooftops and cries of defiance rang out. The rebellion was short-lived, crushed by Ferdinand's troops, with brutal efficiency, but its consequences were devastating. In the aftermath, the monarchs declared that the Muslims had broken the terms of the capitulations by rebelling. The protections of religious freedom were declared void. From that point forward, Islam was no longer tolerated. Thousands of Granadans were forced to accept baptism, creating the population now known as Moriscos. Outwardly Christian, inwardly Muslim, they became a community defined by secrecy and suspicion. Life as a Morisco was fraught with fear. They were compelled to adopt Christian names, attend church services, and baptize their children. Traditional Islamic practices, circumcision, Friday prayers, Arabic script, even wearing Moorish clothing, were outlawed. Yet many refused to abandon their identity completely. Families whispered Quranic verses in the dark, taught prayers to their children in secret, and hid manuscripts in walls or buried them in gardens. Some carved subtle Islamic motifs into furniture or door frames, symbols only the faithful would recognize. In this way, Granada's Islamic heritage continued, not openly, but in shadows and whispers. But secrecy came at a cost. The Inquisition, already notorious for its persecution of Jews and heretics, now turned its gaze upon the Moriscos. Inquisitors prowled Granada, questioning neighbors, spying on households, and investigating any sign of backsliding into Islam. A family that skipped church too often, a child who stumbled over a Christian prayer, or a household that cooked couscous instead of pork, could be accused. Trials were held, punishments ranged from fines to imprisonment, and in the worst cases, executions were staged to terrify the community into submission. The Alpujarras Mountains became a refuge for those who refused to submit. Remote villages, difficult to access, offered some protection for Muslims who clung to their faith and traditions. But even here, Christian officials eventually extended their reach. Rebellions erupted periodically, most famously the revolt of the Alpujarras in 1568-1571, long after the fall of Granada. Though outside the immediate timeline of 1492, This revolt reflected the long legacy of resentment and resistance, seeded in those first years of betrayal. The cultural transformation of Granada was equally dramatic. Mosques were converted into churches. The Great Mosque of Granada, once the city's spiritual heart, was demolished and replaced by a cathedral. Qurans were seized and burned in public squares. Arabic texts erased from libraries. Over time, Arabic itself was suppressed, replaced by Castilian Spanish. Within a generation, children raised as Moriscos often grew up bilingual, their ancestral tongue fading with each passing decade. The culture of Al-Andalus, once a flourishing blend of poetry, science, and architecture, was systematically dismantled. And yet, Granada never entirely lost its Moorish soul. Its architecture, the Alhambra, the general life, the Albaicín's winding alleys, remained. Its food retained traces of North African influence. Its music echoes of Arab Andalusian melodies. Even Christian chroniclers admitted that the city carried a unique character, unlike any other in Spain. The irony of conquest was that, even as Ferdinand and Isabella sought to erase Granada's Islamic past, they could not help but live within it, walk its courtyards, admire its gardens, and marvel at the artistry of the very culture they had subdued. For the Catholic monarchs, Granada's fall had consequences far beyond the city itself. It freed resources and attention for their other grand projects. Just months after the surrender, they authorized Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, launching Spain into an age of empire. The same year they issued the Edict of Expulsion, forcing Spain's Jews to convert or leave. The fall of Granada was not an isolated event, but part of a broader program to create a unified Christian Spain, cleansed of religious diversity, prepared to extend its influence across oceans. To the rest of Europe, the conquest was celebrated as a holy victory. Chroniclers in Italy, France, and even the distant Holy Roman Empire praised Ferdinand and Isabella as champions of Christendom. The Pope hailed the triumph as divine justice. For centuries, Christian kings in Spain had dreamed of this day. Now it had arrived, and its resonance was immense. The Reconquista, a struggle that had lasted for nearly 800 years, was complete. For the Muslim world, however, Granada's fall was a wound that never healed. In North Africa, exiles from Granada arrived in waves, carrying stories of betrayal, forced conversion, and cultural loss. Poets in Morocco and Fez wrote laments for Granada, describing it as a paradise lost, a jewel stolen by unbelievers. The memory of the Alhambra's surrender became a symbol of mourning across the Islamic world, a reminder of the fragility of even the most splendid civilizations. For the Moriscos who remained, life became an endless balancing act, outwardly conforming to Christianity while secretly clinging to Islam, negotiating survival under suspicion and repression. They would endure for more than a century before being finally expelled from Spain in 1609, their presence erased from the land they had inhabited for centuries. But in 1492, none of that was yet certain. The people of Granada, freshly conquered, still held on to hope that the capitulations might one day be honored again. They still gathered in secret to remember the old days, still whispered prayers in Arabic, still dreamed of return. For them, Granada was not simply a city but a memory, a symbol, a home that lived in their hearts even as history moved on. To walk the streets of Granada after the conquest was to feel both beauty and grief, the grandeur of the Alhambra standing unchanged, yet hollowed by loss, the murmur of fountains still flowing, yet echoing with sorrow, the markets alive with trade, yet shadowed by fear. Granada became a city of paradoxes, at once conquered and unconquerable, subdued yet still whispering the voice of Al-Andalus. The fall of Granada was not just the end of a war, it was the transformation of a world. It marked the death of a kingdom, the betrayal of promises, the survival of a culture in secret, and the birth of a Spain that would soon stretch its banners across oceans. For Ferdinand and Isabella, it was triumph. For Boabdil, it was tragedy. For the people of Granada, it was both the end of their past and the uncertain beginning of a painful new future. The story of Granada's fall does not end with the raising of Christian banners over the Alhambra. If anything, that moment was only the beginning of a long and painful transformation, one that would echo for generations. The surrender in January 1492 marked the final victory of the Reconquista, but for the city's people, it was the start of an era of broken promises, cultural erasure, and exile. And yet, Even as history pressed down with merciless weight, Granada remained a place where memory, resilience, and beauty endured. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, many Muslims clung to the assurances written in the capitulations. They prayed in their mosques, taught their children Arabic, and hoped that life might continue with some measure of dignity. For a short while, it did. But by the end of the century, those promises had unraveled completely. The rebellion of 1499 in the Albayacin became the excuse Ferdinand and Isabella needed to declare Islam void in Spain. Forced conversions swept through the city. The call to prayer was silenced. Mosques became churches, and families that had lived in Granada for generations were compelled to kneel before baptismal fonts. The transformation of daily life was profound. Where once the rhythm of the city had been marked by the muezzin's call, it was now the tolling of church bells. Qurans were hidden in secret places, their pages wrapped in cloth and buried beneath floors or tucked behind walls. Children were taught Christian prayers in public but learned the Shahada whispered at night by candlelight. Morisco households lived double lives, outwardly Christian, inwardly Muslim, forever balancing survival with faith. The Inquisition became the dark shadow of this new world. Its officials scoured Granada, searching for signs of heresy. A family that refused to eat pork, a woman caught washing on a Friday, a child who stumbled over a Christian prayer. These could all bring suspicion, interrogation, and punishment. Fear seeped into every household. Neighbors turned on one another, sometimes out of zeal, sometimes out of envy or revenge. For Moriscos, trust became dangerous, secrecy became essential, and life became a constant performance of loyalty to a faith they did not share. And yet, even under such pressure, Granada's people preserved fragments of their identity. They sang songs in Arabic, under the guise of lullabies. They kept recipes alive, blending spices and herbs in ways that carried memory across centuries. They carved Moorish motifs into furniture, stitched them into fabrics, or painted them subtly into walls, hiding beauty in plain sight. The city itself resisted erasure. Its streets, its courtyards, its architecture, all whispered of Al-Andalus. The conquerors could change names, convert mosques, and forbid Arabic, but they could not fully uproot the spirit woven into stone and water. For those who could, exile became the only path. Families sold what little they had left and crossed the Mediterranean to Morocco, Algeria, or the Ottoman lands. These exiles carried with them the sorrow of displacement and the pride of memory. Poets in Fez and Tlemcen composed elegies for Granada, verses dripping with longing for gardens, fountains, and palaces left behind. Granada became a symbol not only of loss but of paradise stolen, a wound that bled across the Islamic world. The very name Granada evoked both beauty and grief, a reminder of the fragility of even the most dazzling civilizations. For Spain, the conquest became the foundation of triumph. Ferdinand and Isabella were celebrated as Catholic monarchs, chosen by God to purify their realm. Their victory emboldened them to expel the Jews later that same year, and to launch Spain into overseas expansion with Columbus's voyage. Granada's fall was not an isolated event. It was the hinge on which Spain swung from medieval struggles to global empire. The city's loss became the empire's gain, its resources and lands fueling the ambitions of a united Christian monarchy. But the paradox of Granada remained. Even as Spain sought to erase Islamic identity, it could not escape the legacy of Al-Andalus. The Alhambra stood as undeniable proof of Muslim artistry, admired even by those who sought to Christianize it. Spanish language absorbed thousands of Arabic words. Spanish cuisine bore Moorish influence, and Spanish music carried echoes of Arab Andalusian rhythms. The very empire that sought to purify itself of Muslim presence could not help but carry that presence in its culture, its art, and its soul. Boabdil, the last sultan, slipped into exile after surrendering his city. Some accounts say he lived quietly in the Alpujarras mountains for a time before leaving for North Africa. Others suggest he died in battle, fighting for his hosts. What is certain is that he lived with the memory of his loss until the end. Remembered as the man who gave up Granada. For his enemies he was weak. For his people he was tragic. His tears at the mountain pass, the Moor's sigh, echo through legend, capturing the sorrow of an entire civilization in one broken man. Centuries later, Granada still carries that sorrow. To walk its streets is to feel layers of history pressing close. The grandeur of Nasrid palaces, the solemnity of Christian cathedrals, the winding alleys of the Albaicin whispering of lost prayers. The city became a palimpsest, each layer overwriting the last but never fully erasing it. The fountains of the Alhambra still murmur, carrying with them the memory of poets, scholars, and rulers long gone. The mountains still hold the echoes of refugees who looked back one last time before leaving forever. And so the story of Granada is both an ending and a survival. It was the end of Muslim rule in Spain, the final act of the Reconquista, but it was also the survival of memory, of culture, of identity carried in whispers, recipes, songs and stones. For the Moriscos it was survival in secrecy. For the exiles it was survival in longing. For Spain itself it was survival in contradiction, the attempt to erase Al-Andalus even as it built upon its legacy. As the centuries rolled on, the story of Granada became myth. For Christians, it was a tale of divine triumph. For Muslims, it was a lament of betrayal and loss. For historians, it is a study in the fragility of promises and the endurance of memory. And for Granada itself, it is simply life, carried forward through beauty and sorrow, through survival and silence. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine standing in the courtyards of the Alhambra at twilight. The fountains still flow, their water catching the last light of the sun. The tiles still shimmer, their Arabic verses praising paradise, yet above them hangs the cross, a reminder of conquest. You hear whispers of prayers in Arabic, faint, almost hidden, blending with the chants of monks. You see the ghost of Boabdil riding away, his tears falling as the mountains echo his sigh. The story ends not with a clash of swords but with silence. The silence of a city mourning its past. The silence of promises broken. The silence of memory carried forward in secret. Granada fell, but it never vanished. Its beauty remains, its sorrow endures, and its whispers still echo in the stones. And so, with the tale told, let your eyes grow heavy. The fountains of Granada murmur softly, like lullabies carried across centuries. The Alhambra's walls glow faintly in the moonlight, their verses whispering of paradise lost, but not forgotten. Rest now, knowing that even in the face of conquest, memory survives, and beauty endures. Sleep gently with Granada's story fading into the quiet of night. Good night. Sweet dreams.